Well, let's go ahead and get into it. And y'all can still see my screen, okay, right? You see climate
Yeah.
impacts on archives. Okay, great. I have a
Sure.
kind of new computing setup here at home, and I'm never sure when things go into energy saver mode, what
Mhm.
is what is closed out without my awareness. All right, so we're going to talk. We started this morning talking about climate change at a big international level. And then we kind of talked about climate change in our own personal levels. And now we're kind of going back to the professional side of things and talking about climate impacts on archives, which I think is why most of us signed up for this. So from my perspective, there are four ways in which climate change has impacts on archives. And there are these four areas. So roughly speaking, you could divide this into the people and the stuff, right? So on the people side of things, we have our users. So a lot of times this is particularly true for government archives. When there are disasters that happen, archives that steward vital records often are put into kind of a crunch period where they have to provide lots of copies of records to people who may have lost their vital records during a disaster. And also on the people side of things, we know that, just like archivists are miracle workers, we're also not immune to being impacted by disasters ourselves. So in prior disasters that have happened, archivists can also be displaced, just as residents of a community can be displaced. Obviously, disasters are the things that take up a lot of our attention, but I also want to really help us expand our focus a little bit beyond just disasters, right? Disasters are like the headline grabbing thing. They're like, this is what we know we need to do preparation around. But there's a lot of things about climate change that don't necessarily result in like disaster that also will still impact the day-to-day work that we have as archivists. So even just thinking about how like changes in the weather can impact staffing commutes, I think is a big thing. This is something I used to think about a lot back when I my prior role was at the University of Cincinnati, and I took a bus to work every day that did not have a great shelter for where I would pick up the bus. And earlier in the workshop, I said one of the issues we're dealing with here is rain, and sometimes the rain will overflow our storm systems. Well, let me tell you that waiting for a bus while lots of cars drive by, sending up water over you is a real great way to not have a great commute, right? So thinking about like a lot of people are going to keep having experiences like that, just trying to get to work, regardless of whether there's a disaster going on or not. Obviously, within our work, we are very conscientious of how climate change impacts our collections, right? So we know that, of course, standard like archival canonical practice is trying to have stable environmental conditions for collections. You don't want a lot of rapidly changing temperature and humidity fluctuations. That is usually not a super great environment for archival records. And even though there is a lot of research that's come out in the last decade or so about how, we like kind of the old school way of thinking was like, you have to keep, your environmental storage conditions like at this specific temperature point and this specific humidity level, and you may not depart from that. That is sort of, there's a lot more new thinking about that now based on a lot of research from like the Image Permanence Institute about how there's an acceptable range of, storage conditions that are copacetic. But that said, we still don't want like massive fluctuations, right, happening over
over the course of a short period of time because materials.
It's all about the delta, right? It's all about the diurnal fluctuations, and you want to keep those small, and you can actually be a way different place in the cool and dry scale as long as your delta is minimized.
Right. Yeah, as long as you're not like going from one extreme to another. So right. So obviously, every archive fears a burst pipe, and that is something that with freeze thaw cycles getting weirder is an issue. I did a prototype of a map earlier this year where I've always wanted a map documenting disasters in libraries, archives, and museums, and there's not one that exists currently. And so what I did was I did this in January, and I looked the previous month through Google News of any news story I could find on archives that had some kind of weather-related disaster. And I think like 11 of the 12 stories I found were about burst pipes that happened at libraries across the country over Christmas because there was like a cold snap in many parts of the country where they were not used to having cold snaps, and then there was a burst pipe. So that's like the kind of thing that, you know, when there's unpredictable weather happening in areas could become more of an issue. And there was actually probably the most prominent, this happened, you know, I found like 12 versions of this story across the country, but the most prominent one was that there was a burst pipe because of freezing events happening at the Colorado State Archives. And there were some pretty sad looking pictures that came out of that. Obviously, climate change also stresses our infrastructure too. So HVAC systems are increasingly taxed by these weird heat and humidity conditions. And also, I think one thing that I am trying to surface more onto people's radar is like issues with our power grid. And I know that this is something that y'all in California are particularly sensitized to. But, you know, when we have these collections that are on servers, like sometimes it's worth asking, like, are those servers, like, which servers are they on? What geographic area are they in? You know, is it only a local server that is like, you know, in an area where there's been a lot of like blackouts in recent years because of power grid issues? So something to consider. There are also climate change impacts that happen. We also, so those are kind of like the 4 areas in which we have climate change impacts: infrastructure, collections, users, staff. Then we also have sort of these short and long-term scenarios we're thinking about. So, of course, the long-term is things like sea level rise, whether we are going to have displaced communities. But again, even just like day-to-day, you know, non-disaster related issues can pop up. And I think that this example from the Newberry Library that they posted on their Twitter account last year was really illustrative of this, where you know, they, for those of you who have worked with like rare books, like, you know, vellum is very sensitive to humidity, and so they made the decision that they could not page those materials on a day when it was particularly humid in Chicago. And of course, what do we know about climate change in the Midwest? We are going to be dealing with more humid days. So think about this from the perspective of a user, right? What if we had, you know, I mean, I don't know, I'd have to talk to the folks at the Newberry, but what if you were, you know, a PhD student who had like made arrangements to go and use these rare materials and had planned your whole summer around it, and you get there and you can't use the stuff, right? So I think that these kinds of, like, I think my point that I keep trying to make is it doesn't have to take a disaster for climate change to be impacting our archives, our collections, our users, our staff. And that's why I'm so adamant that we need to be starting this work now. Okay. So I think I had said earlier this morning that it is really helpful when libraries and archives like literally do anything. Like even if they just have like, hey, we're the sustainability people, and now we, relamped all of our lights and they're now all LED, and here's how much power savings we had. Like, that's great, because you got to start somewhere, right? And it might seem a little frivolous, but truly, the more data we have on what people are doing, the better. And I'm sorry to sound like a corporate shill right now, but this is totally a case of like, you can't like manage what you can't measure, right? So a lot of times people will ask me, well, like, how much energy are archives taking up really? And it's like, well, we don't know. Like, we can't answer that issue because it's not like we have a unified database where all archives are reporting their greenhouse gas emissions, their energy consumption, and all of that. So we really can only make educated guesses. But there have been a couple of great case studies coming out that I am like totally obsessed with. So the two that I'm going to show you here. So the first one is from Penn State University Libraries. So this is for the academic library system. And for those of you who are familiar with Project Drawdown is a very cool kind of like organization, publication, research organization that looks at all of these ways in which the world can get to net zero emissions. And like, I have the Project Drawdown book is like the coolest coffee table book that has ever existed about climate change. Like, because you open it up and it's like, did you know if we just switch to, like really innovative crop rotation strategies, like we can save, this much, we can prevent this much nitrogen in the soil or whatever, or added fertilizer. So it's a really cool thing. Anyway, Project Drawdown kind of has a lot of like local instantiations. And one of them, there's a Project Drawdown group that's at Penn State University. And so one of my close collaborators, Ben Goldman, is an archivist at Penn State University. And what they did was they basically did an energy assessment of like all of their building energy usage and trying to figure that out. They also attempted to measure employee commuter patterns. And I think this is kind of a cool way they did it. What they did was they looked at how many employees had parking permits, looked at their home address zip codes, and then kind of tried to use the zip code to home zip code to library zip code to estimate their commute. So anyway, this is what they found, which was that so the that acronym there, like MTCO2E, if I recall correctly, I think that's metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So sometimes there are, greenhouse gases that are not carbon dioxide, they're still quite harmful, but because carbon dioxide is usually the main one that's reported, you can kind of come up with an equivalent measure. Anyway, so the main takeaway that they found is basically that most of the emissions for their organization come from buildings. And that's not surprising. Like, buildings are a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. In like universities, that is typically the largest source of emissions is buildings. Buildings are such a large source of emissions that now, like, the city of New York has this thing called Local Law 97, where any building that is over 25,000 square feet has to meet energy efficiency standards, like by 2030. And that's because the city of New York has calculated that building emissions make up 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions in New York City. So building emissions are, for many jurisdictions, are often the largest source of emissions. After that, it's usually transportation. So buildings and transportation are a big one. So this is a great study to look at. I think that they have put all of their data into the institutional repository. So I am just waiting for more institutions to replicate this study. Hint, hint. So if anyone ever does this, it would be great to see your work. So then I can put it in a future presentation. And this, I won't repeat this. You can read it later. But again, they found that the majority of their emissions, so like 95% of the library emissions, could be traced back to building consumption patterns. Okay, the second case study that I like to show, this is one that was published, I think, within the last year. This is from the Rockefeller Archives Center, which is the archives for the Rockefeller Foundation and other philanthropic organizations. So this is based in New York. And they also did an energy audit of their operations between 2016 and 2020, and found, if you are reading this closely, you will notice that this is also a lot of building emissions, right? So heating, lighting, cooling, etc. The 35% that goes to their IT center, I think, is very, very interesting. And one of the things that they found is that when they were looking at this multi-year period, that IT-related energy use had increased, whereas other energy uses had decreased. And I talked to Hillel Arnold about this, and I believe that they are now doing another energy audit that is looking specifically just at their IT infrastructure. So that will be really, really interesting to see when that comes out. And I think that this was mentioned in the quote here. Yeah, so I'm not sure, I can't speak for Hillel, but I think that this is also complicated by the fact that, you know, it's one thing to measure your on-site IT infrastructure, right? Because like we've all looked at a utility bill. You can look at a utility bill and it tells you exactly, you know, how many kilowatts of power that you've, or, you know, whatever it is that you have consumed. But like there's usually not that level of transparency for cloud providers, right? So I'll be very interested to see if they build that into their next study. Okay, so then so those are a couple of case studies. If we zoom out and look at a more kind of holistic, like what does everything look like in the United States? So Ben Goldman and I, along with a couple of his colleagues from Penn State University Libraries, a few years ago, we did a study where we had a data set of 1,200 archives, and this came out of OCLC's archive grid. And what we did was we tried to model potential climate change impacts. And what we found, and you know, this like actually isn't that surprising of a finding, is that more than 90% of archives would be impacted by at least one climate change factor, right? And the reason that makes sense is because literally every part of the United States is going to be impacted by at least one climate change factor, right? So literally everywhere is going to experience at least something to some scale, right? What is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night, and I've already touched on this a couple of times, is what is happening to our coastal archives. So what does that look like, not just with sea level rise, but storm surge, which is typically associated with hurricanes or typhoons. You know, that can sort of push what is normal tide levels up by several feet. And so there are a number of archives that are in pretty vulnerable coastal areas. So that is something that I think we're going to have to keep an eye on over the next few years. I'll talk about this slide in just a second, but I'm just looking over at the chat. Cryptocurrency. My goodness, don't get me started on cryptocurrency. Like that's going to be my oh God, that's going to be when I just totally lose it. Like every time I read about crypto. It's
Yeah.
so bad.
And climate justice, like let's just look at the map of where cryptocurrency gets mined and where global poverty is worst and where climate impact will be most felt.
The really awful thing about crypto is like I think this is even happening in North America. Like there are literally coal-fired power plants that have gone offline that are coming back online just for mining crypto, which is just like,
I just had to bring it up because it's one of those things that make me go out of my mind every time I think about it.
I know.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to trigger. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. It's just completely enraging. Yeah, sign of a very, very weird society. Okay, so one of the things, like, before I was mentioning that we can't manage what you can't measure, right? And when I was talking about this earlier study that I did, which was 1,200 archives that came from the OCLC archive grid data set, which is for those of you who aren't familiar with this, the archive grid data set is basically fairly large, and I use large in quotes, archives that have mostly managed to make at least some of their finding aids available online. But what OCLC's archive grid data set leaves out is many small archives, especially community archives, because a lot of times those are places that don't necessarily have EAD finding aids online. And so when we were doing this research, one of the things, I had lived in New Orleans for several years. And so I got to be very familiar with a lot of the small archives in New Orleans. And so when we were doing this original study, I was paying close attention to what I was seeing in New Orleans. And I was like, this data set doesn't have a lot of those small archives that I was very familiar with in New Orleans. So that was when Ben and I were like, well, we need a better data set, right? Because we don't have like a data set that is truly representative of the diversity of archives that exist out there. So that was what the repo data project became. So Ben and I got this grant from the Society of American Archivists. And what we did was we compiled a list of around 150 archival associations. There are actually that many in the United States. Everything from Society of American Archivists to Society of California Archivists to all of the city, things. I hope we contacted LA as subject. I can't remember. But what we did was we asked those organizations, like, do you have any kind of list of all of the archives in your wheelhouse, right? So contacting like the Midwest Archives Conference, right? Like, do you guys have a list of all of the known archives in your membership area? And then what we did was we cleaned all that data up and put it together. And we had a data set that then became, I think the final number was around 18,000 unique data points. So you can just see in the before and after with just Ohio. So the before picture is just the OCLC archive grid data set. And then on the right-hand side, this is after repo data. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with Ohio geography, there's 3 major cities in Ohio. There's Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland, the 3 Cs. They're kind of in a diagonal line from the southwest to the northeast. So that's why you see in those areas a lot more clustering happening. And you also see a lot more archives in these rural areas too. So a lot of times those archives are not necessarily places that we would think of as archives. They might be like the township clerk office, right? But guess what? Like that clerk's office has a lot of historical records in it. So anyway, that was just this really important project that we put together in order to sort of enable people to better understand where archives are, because if you don't understand where archives are, you're going to have a much more difficult time assessing the climate impacts and climate risks with them. So this is what the entire data set of repo data looks like. out there. Nevada, like I'm sure Nevada has more archives than that, but like they really only had a few in our data set. And some states kind of got a little bit overrepresented because some states had done surveys through their state historical records advisory boards. And so some states could be like, we could tell you every village township office where there are historical records, and others couldn't give us that information. So that's why also there's some degree of difference between some of the states. So, okay, what can you do with this data? You can look at interesting things. One of the things that we are really fortunate about in the United States is that we have incredible environmental information and data that is provided free to us by the federal government. So one of the things that you can do once you have data points is that you can layer it with different maps. And I'll, in the last section of today, I will show you how you can access some of these mapping tools and actually look at them. So these are just some screenshots though. So this was, this is something that's probably of more interest to people in the Southeast, but you can look at sort of like if there's an active hurricane, right? Where is the cone of uncertainty, as it's called, right? And what archives are in that path. So this was a snapshot I took from when Hurricane Florence was approaching the East Coast a few years ago. This was an example from St. Louis. So one of the other things that you can get with federal government weather data is current stream gauges and flooding conditions. So you can take a look and get a sense of what archives are within a certain area of overflowing stream gauges. This is the scary animation. This is projected sea level rise from 1 to 6. I think this goes up to 6 feet of sea level rise. This is Charleston, South Carolina. So all of these, all of those orange points represent archives.